I'd like to start off by giving a little introduction into who I am and why I'm presenting to you today. My name is Jason Finucan, and I'm the founder of a company called Stigma Zero. But first, I'd like to explain why I know a little bit about mental illness and stigma. The first is, I actually come at this from the perspective of lived experience. Now, you may be wondering why I'm referencing physical illness when I'm in a talk about mental illness, and I'll explain that quickly. When I was a young boy, I had open heart surgery as a result of a nerve defect in my heart. And while I went through this very significant health challenge, I learned something inadvertently and completely unconsciously. And what it was that when you have an illness that everyone understands, that everyone can wrap their heads around, that they can imagine, then there is no stigma around that illness. I went through 4 years from the time that I first had symptoms until I had the open heart surgery, where I was facing this illness and it was affecting my school, it was affecting my life, and not once did anyone ever question my work ethic, my character. Everyone understood that I was unfortunate to have an illness like this. Now, when you fast forward until my mid-20s, in the intervening years I was healthy, I was very lucky. But unfortunately in my mid-20s I began experiencing the symptoms of something called bipolar disorder. Now this is where things got very different very quickly. It started with myself. I had enormous stigma towards mental illness as it turned out. I didn't really know it until I did it to myself as soon as I began experiencing these symptoms. I did not want to tell my colleagues, my friends, or my family members. In fact, I spent almost 2 years with ever worsening symptoms where I refused treatment and I simply worked through the symptoms of bipolar disorder, a major mental illness. That affected my productivity at work, something called presenteeism, which I'll discuss with you soon. And the net result was a lot of my time was wasted in an effort to hide something that I couldn't hide from. In 2005, I was finally officially diagnosed and began treatment. And within 6 months, I finally gave up this weight that stigma had put on my shoulders. And I broke through that barrier and realized that stigma in and of itself is one of the key factors in how we are responding or not responding to mental illness in the workplace. So I have seen stigma in the workplace from both sides, and I've gone and done enormous academic research on the topic of stigma and of mental illness, including writing a white paper. And the reason I did all of this was because I wanted to speak out about mental illness and about stigma in particular, sharing my story as a way to help others. And I did this for many years, ultimately leading to the founding of my company, Stigma Zero. I'm also the instructor in a program called Create Your Stigma Zero Workplace, which we offer to all of our clients to help them improve their response to mental illness in the workplace and ultimately to eradicate stigma. And finally, I have published a book as well, some sort of a half memoir, half how-to in trying to help others, again, respond to this complex challenge. This is the cover of my book. It's called Jason 1 Stigma Zero, My Battle with Mental Illness at Home and in the Workplace. This is the white paper I referenced. Now, that white paper was published in the Canadian Journal of Administrative Sciences. I was a co-author with my colleague Sarah Nogue. And that paper specifically challenged the idea that if you reduce stigma in the workplace, there is an ROI. And we proved it. And that's something that really was the foundation of much of the work that I do with companies today. This 6 Steps to Improve Mental Health in Your Workplace is a more recent white paper that I've published, and that's what I'm going to be sharing with you today, the contents of that paper. So, all of this that I've learned until now has helped me to realize this simple truth. The stigma that surrounds mental illness in the workplace is an expensive problem that hurts employees and ruins company culture. I've also learned that a key element of positive mental health in the workplace is the ability for organizations to quickly respond and to respond effectively to mental illness. Now, when nearly all employers where they fall short is in addressing the stigma that still surrounds mental illness. Many employers think that just simply making people aware of the problem is enough, but I'll explain why it isn't. Now, the reason they fail to address stigma, whether they're unwilling or they're just unable to do so, is partly related to the following 4 realities facing every workplace today, including yours. The first is that mental illness is common. Now, many of you, I know I'm preaching to the choir here, you know that mental illness is common. One of the stats that I'd like to highlight is that 62% of missed workdays can be attributed to mental health conditions. As you can imagine, that is a staggering statistic. It is a very high number and something that shows that we need to address this. The next is that there is stigma in your workplace. Now, this may sound a little presumptuous, but the simple fact is this. Stigma is a trap our society sets us up to fall into. There are many reasons why that I can't go into in such a short session, but trust me in this, if you don't train individuals to overcome stigma, they will have stigma towards mental illness. It's just easier to have it than it is to not have it. So knowing that there's stigma in your workplace, it is something that I urge you to address. Now, 98% of people agree that people with mental illness are discriminated against and stigmatized against. That is an extremely high number. The third reality is that it's costing you money. The simple fact is many people think that mental illness in the workplace is primarily a social problem, but it is a business problem as well. In fact, I would argue it's primarily a business problem when you consider the impacts that it's having. Look at the central stat here. $16.3 trillion is the projected global cost of mental health disorders between 2011 and 2030. Now remember when I spoke about my 2 years of presenteeism, that's how this happens. A person hides their mental illness because they're afraid to disclose it. They're afraid of the stigma surrounding it. So they try to work through an illness when they shouldn't. And when you have a lot of people working at 50, 60, or 70% productivity, that adds up to a whole lot of lost in profits. Now, the good news, and the fourth reality, is that there is something you can do about it. Now, 66% of managers reported not having training when it comes to intervening with employees who show depression. And those managers recognize that if they did have training, they might be able to have a positive impact on this situation. And that speaks to the way forward that we see here at Stigma Zero. And it's simply this. Mental illness, a lot like cancer, can't be cured. It can be treated. It can be managed. But I sit here in front of you with bipolar disorder. I've never been cured of it, and as of right now, there is no cure available to me. I can treat it and I can manage it. But stigma was something that afflicted me very badly and affected my life in a major way, and I overcame it completely. And I have helped many others do the same thing. The fact is, stigma is a matter of perspective, of education, of understanding, and it is something that can be overcome. It can be eradicated completely. Now, there are benefits to having a Stigma Zero workplace. There are many benefits. I'll go through them quickly here. Of course, you will have an increase in productivity, and that is largely a result of the reduction in presenteeism. You will be able to attract new hires. There are many people out there in the workplace who are looking for organizations that they can trust will take care of them both in body and mind. It's not just about the physical illnesses and the package and the benefits package. They need to know that if they're sick, if they have a mental illness, that they will be taken care of. I mentioned reducing presenteeism. Improving culture is a massive part of this. When you have a company that steps forward and publicly announces, we are a Stigma Zero workplace, when we are not going to allow an individual who has a mental illness be treated or discriminated against, treated negatively, that improves the culture and improves the sense of positive workplace morale. You will retain your talent because any group of individuals who recognize that their employer is behind them in this way, they're going to want to stay. And so your top talent aren't going to be leaving for that reason. And finally, you all know supporting your employees is just good business. And this is one key way to do it. So this all sounds good, but how can you achieve all of this? Well, the answer is training. Highly specific training that will ultimately eradicate stigma and improve the response to mental illness. Because awareness is simply not enough. Many organizations have improved their efforts in increasing awareness and increasing mental health literacy at a basic level, but they have not reaped the benefits that I've just mentioned. And the reason is because they're stopping short. So let's get into the crux of this presentation, the 6 steps that you can take today to improve mental health in your workplace. And the first is a foundational one that I've mentioned already, but developing mental health literacy, you must start there. But there is a key to understanding that when I say awareness isn't enough, developing mental health literacy isn't enough either, but it is still a foundational step. And the first step is to provide specific and different education for your employees, managers, HR personnel, and senior leaders. Education that acknowledges those different roles and the responsibilities involved and addresses those in a specific way. This is also very key. Supporting mental health and dealing with mental illness are 2 very, very different things. Having a gym in your workplace in order to promote positive physical health is a great step, and it's an important step, and I recommend you do the same thing when it comes to promoting and supporting mental health. But when a person is diagnosed with cancer or heart disease, having that gym alone is not going to do it. You need more. You need to acknowledge those illnesses specifically. And right now, that's not happening with illnesses like clinical depression, anxiety disorder, bipolar disorder, and more. So that's what I mean by understanding the difference between mental health and mental illness. Understanding the impact of stigma. This is vital for everyone at every level to understand why stigma cannot be allowed anymore. It needs to be looked at in the same way we look at racism and sexism in the workplace. It's simply not appropriate, it's toxic, it's negative, and it's going to have a negative impact. And when we eradicate it, we absolutely improve the way this workplace functions. The second step is to improve is appropriate action and response. And to develop or prepare for the appropriate action and response, you need training that goes into providing specific tools for employees, specific training that is situational based, giving individuals the idea of, well, what if you're in this particular situation that is real, based on real life, such as you're at the coffee machine and you overhear someone speaking about a third colleague who is off on a sick leave and someone speaking negatively about them? What do you do? What should you say and what shouldn't you say? Similar to that, we go into very in-depth training. Now, strategies for action and response to workplace mental illness, they need to apply to the individual for themselves as well as their colleagues. And what I mean by that is, when a person is experiencing symptoms of a mental illness like I did, they need the training to know how to recognize that, how to respond to it, how to bring it up to their manager and HR rep, but they also need to know how to respond when a colleague goes through it and they're healthy. So it's from both perspectives. Now, the third step is development of empathy and emotional intelligence. This is so vital to the success of any employee and, frankly, to the elimination of stigma. And the reasons are as follows. Empathy is required to understand a situation that you don't have any experience with. So how can an individual who's never experienced clinical depression understand or empathize with me when I go through that exact thing, a clinical depression? Well, the answer is empathy allows them to reach out, find that information, and imagine what it's like to go through that. That is a key factor in how people can communicate about such complex things. And emotional intelligence is essential to respond in a positive, effective manner to any complex situation. And as you can imagine, mental illness in the workplace, it qualifies as a complex situation. But the benefit here is developing your employees' emotional intelligence and empathy is excellent just in general professional development. It will improve their performance in any role. So there is a nice side effect there as well. Now, the fourth step of the 6 is to build a psychologically healthy workplace. Eliminating stigma will help increase the psychological safety of your workplace. Having a psychologically safe workplace will allow people to thrive, and that is a key factor, and you can't have that if stigma is allowed to live. Now, creating opportunities for your employees to flourish regardless of their health. We want to address, of course, the individuals who are experiencing these mental illnesses, but we also want to have a psychologically safe workplace for the people who are healthy and who wonder what would happen to me if I one day experience this. They need to know that their employer, you, are supporting them. Now, the second half to building a psychologically healthy workplace is that workplace culture and leadership styles, they play an important role in supporting psychological health. How you establish your leadership styles within your workplace goes a long, long way. And it frankly just makes good business sense for companies overall, as well as for employees. The fifth step that you can use to improve mental health in your workplace is to address manager and HR response to workplace stigma. As I said earlier, one of the realities is there is stigma in your workplace, so how are you going to respond to it? And how can you improve that response? The answer is that remember that you as leaders are influencers of change within an organization, both positive and negative. And I hope in your case it will be positive. And often often you're in the best position to respond to employees, particularly managers. Managers experience employees' behavior the closest, and they're in the best position to have that initial conversation if need be. And finally, having specific scenario training, again, specific to the manager or to the HR person, where you look at a scenario where I have a team of 8 people and 2 of them have in the last 3 months fairly significantly changed their performance and their behavior. What do I do about this? How can I ask them or discuss with them in a way that respects their privacy but offers my help and make sure that we as an employer are supporting them in the way that we need? That kind of level of training is vital to the success of this endeavor. And the 6th step is sustainable development of policies and guidelines. Again, you understand how vital it is to have appropriate policies and ones that will work and will last. The problem is, in many organizations, physical illnesses like cancer and mental illnesses like depression are treated completely differently. Sometimes this is in writing, sometimes this is in the application of the policies. So medical absence policies are often applied inconsistently. This is what makes someone like me, back when I first experienced my symptoms, afraid to come forward and reveal that I had a mental illness because I was afraid of how I'd be treated, both socially and professionally. And it can be terrifying, and that has to be completely removed from the equation. Now, services such as your employee assistance program or any other benefits program, they can inadvertently stigmatize employees with a mental illness. I'm going to share with you an example. I've consulted with many organizations on their programs, their policies and their benefits programs. And in one case, their EAP actually listed depression and anxiety in the same category as anger management issues, rather than recognizing it as an actual illness. So cancer, for example, and heart disease and diabetes were all off in a different segment under illness, and yet depression and anxiety was listed under anger management issues. Could you imagine being an employee in that organization and seeing your EAP do this? It essentially was institutionalized stigma. That's the kind of thing that you need to make sure isn't happening in your workplace. Now, when I talked about training as the solution for all of this, training must be effective and have clear goals. You must develop the following knowledge and skills through this training. First, of course, the base level mental health literacy, understanding what it is we're dealing with and why it matters. The second is employee action and response. The third is promoting a psychologically healthy workplace. The next are manager and HR response, as well as developing sustainable and appropriately applied guidelines and policies. Personal and professional growth across the board, when you invest in that in your employees, such as emotional intelligence and empathy, you will reap significant rewards. And finally, I'd like to discuss a solution. We offer with Stigma Zero something that I mentioned earlier called the Create Your Stigma Zero Workplace Program, of which I am the instructor. And I mentioned to you that it's required to have different levels of training for different levels of the individuals within your organization. So you see here, we have employees, workplace-specific training. Then we have manager-specific training, additional scenario training, and other manager-specific training. And finally, HR leadership, which gets company-wide policies and guidelines training and other training specific to their level. These are the 3 tracks of our Create Your Stigma Zero Workplace program. And the way it works is everyone takes the content that the employees see, only managers and HR take what the managers see, and then only the HR and senior leaders take that final track. And that is a way to develop that learning. Now, the way that the learning is shown to you, it is an e-learning program. It's online, and it involves or includes all of these features. For example, there are video guides, of course, but there are also tools, downloadable resources, templates and guidelines, individual and group activities. There is interactivity all the way throughout to keep it engaging and interesting for the learners. There's curated content. So in many occasions, you'll be reading something or listening to a video, and then you'll be asked to click a link that takes you completely out of the program to a sourced, curated bit of content that is relevant to the topic at hand. So it's never just from one perspective that the training is offered. And when it's done, each individual receives a certificate of completion. And one of the things I'd like to highlight as well is in building this online training program, we at Stigma Zero partnered with Pure and Applied, a consultancy who helped us. They are experts in the ed tech space, and they helped us to build the most comprehensive but also engaging e-learning platform possible. We wanted this to be something that an individual could take and perhaps take an hour one day and then come back 2 weeks later and pick up where they left off and be able to follow through and still gain the insights and the knowledge that they need. And that's what we have achieved with this program. And we invite you, as you work, as I hope you will, to take those 6 steps to improve mental health in your workplace. We invite you to help build your own Stigma Zero certified workplace and work with us to eliminate stigma once and for all. Thank you very much. And again, I hope that this session was helpful to you. And if you are interested in learning more, feel free to reach out to us at stigmazero.com. Thank you. Did you know there used to be stigma for women with breast cancer? Yeah. In the 40s and 50s, it was socially taboo for a woman to disclose a diagnosis of breast cancer. There was no good reason for this stigma. Similar to mental illness today, it was rooted in fear and a lack of understanding, both of the illness and of how to respond. So there was no show of public support, like the denim and pink ribbon days we have now. Can you imagine a woman facing a diagnosis of breast cancer almost completely alone? Things couldn't be more different today. Unfortunately, social attitudes towards and understanding of mental illness have not evolved as much as they have with breast cancer, but we are getting there. Thankfully, though, there has been a dramatic evolution since the Middle Ages. Let's go as far back as the 1600s to see how truly shocking the stigma and the treatment of people with mental illness once was. In Europe in the 1600s, those considered mentally insane were chained in dungeons with criminals, vagrants, and people with disabilities. They were beaten, given little food, and had no clothing. In Europe in the 1700s to early 1800s, medical treatment was both a remedy and a punishment. Treatments included bloodletting, purging and induced vomiting, cold water dunking, essentially water torture, and the swinging chair, a contraption designed to spin the patient at high speeds. The chair was thought useful in helping patients to vomit, evacuate the contents of their bladder, and lull them into a tranquilized state of mind. In Europe in the late 1800s, concern for the mentally ill increased. The use of chains and shackles was forbidden. Patients were removed from dungeons and allowed to stay in sunny rooms and walk outside. In the US in the early 1800s, Mental patients were chained in basement cells. Public viewing of patients was allowed for entertainment purposes. In 1812, Benjamin Rush, a founding father of psychiatry, published medical inquiries and observations upon the diseases of the mind. He saw mental illness as psychological in nature and believed the cause to be abnormal blood circulation. During this time, there was the continued use of bloodletting, spinning therapy, and the tranquilizer chair, a device used to control blood flow to the brain, reduce motor activity, and reduce the force and frequency of pulse. In the US in the late 1800s, although spinning devices were banned, patients were forcefully trained to act in a civil manner in exchange for certain privileges such as food and clothing. In the US in the early 1900s, the era of institutionalization began. Patients were kept in massive, overcrowded asylums. Treatment deteriorated, and the eugenic movement led to viewing mental patients as contaminants of the gene pool. Laws were enacted concerning compulsory sterilization. In the 20th century, asylum medication included treatments such as insulin-induced comas, electroconvulsive therapy, lobotomy, and antipsychotic medications. In the 20th and 21st century, mental illness begins appearing prominently in pop culture. Examples include One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, The Shining, Homeland, Silver Linings Playbook, and more. All of these helped to convey some very incorrect information about mental illness, which in turn helped to reinforce stigma. When I think about experiencing sadness, which we all do, I find that a lot of people confuse clinical depression and sadness. They ask me, how does it feel to be clinically depressed, and are you sad? And the truth is, many people do experience sadness when they're clinically depressed, but there's a key difference. What I use as an analogy to help people understand this is what I call the death in the family analogy. And it is simply that we all can remember a time where we were at a funeral because of the passing of a loved one. And of course, it's a sad time. We're mourning, we're experiencing loss, but someone says something about that individual that is funny, or that just makes people smile, and there's this levity in the room. And at that moment, I call that coming up for air. And I think that is a really natural and positive and healthy thing to do as you grieve and as you process an emotion that is very heavy and very big. When I suffered from clinical depression, there was no coming up for air. It didn't feel like that. And I felt it more like it descended or began, and it would last every minute of every day until it lifted. And there was nothing that I could do. There was no activity. There was no story I could hear. There was nothing that I could do that would make it lift. Even the things I absolutely loved suddenly brought zero pleasure to me. And for me, that's a key difference in understanding sadness, which is a healthy way to process something, and an illness like clinical depression, which is something that can overwhelm you for a long period of time. Now, the people in my life who tried to support me through this, my girlfriend at the time, she was wonderful at being patient and being supportive and trying to remind me that this wasn't my fault, all of which helped immensely. But the truth was, there was nothing to do but wait it out and just believe that I would get better at some point, which thankfully I did. Clinical depression and sadness, it's easy to think of them as similar, and that's okay, but I think it's really incorrect to think of them as exactly the same thing. The cost of stigma in a workplace goes beyond the financial costs faced by the company. It includes the toll individuals face to their well-being, as well as their teams. The reason these costs are often overlooked is that they tend to be invisible, except to the person who lives them. And that's not the only blind spot we may have. You see, demographic diversity comes in visible and non-visible forms. Differentiating characteristics of employees that are visible include factors such as age, race, sex, ethnicity, and a person's physical appearance. Differentiating characteristics that are non-visible include religion, social memberships, national origins, sexual orientation, and illness, including mental illness. That means some of our employees, colleagues, and leaders may have invisible identities that can complicate workplace interactions. The threat of stigmatization, discrimination, and unfair treatment can prevent people from revealing their invisible identities at work and in life. And when people choose not to reveal their true identities at work, they do so out of fear. Fear of not being accepted for who they are, or of losing advantages or opportunities for career advancement as a result. Not revealing, or passing, is essentially an act of self-preservation. Given the statistics we've shared related to the prevalence of mental illness, we can say there are many employees and leaders who are actively passing on disclosing their mental illness at work today. You might think, well, that's not a bad solution. We'll just keep these aspects of ourselves private. Mental illness can be a private matter to someone. While people are well within their rights to keep their identities private, and may have good reason to do so, they may be protecting themselves or people close to them, a goal can be to create a workplace and a world where people with mental illness can feel safe in disclosing who they are. As well, there are many negative side effects for those with a mental illness and those who work with someone who is passing on disclosing their mental illness. When employees and leaders feel unsafe to reveal their identity, they must engage in additional actions every day in order to keep up the appearance that they are just like everyone else. Research shows that they do so in 3 different ways: by having to fabricate information about themselves, by hiding information about themselves, and by avoiding topics and conversations that might reveal their identities. So people who are not disclosing their identities at work have an extra heavy cognitive load to bear by keeping their identity hidden. This has a very adverse effect on the individual, their work, and their team. These are the hidden costs I was talking about. Keeping these secrets and others at a distance makes individuals feel isolated and burdened when performing at work. As a result, passers tend to have more limited networks and mentoring relationships, which affects their career potential and opportunities for advancement. Not to mention the internal conflict of the ongoing cost-benefit analysis going on in their minds about, do I or don't I reveal, and anticipating a potentially negative response. Not disclosing mental illness affects the team by putting a strain on work relationships and team dynamics, which in turn prevents everyone from achieving their productive potential. When people avoid sharing personal information out of fear, it limits other people's ability to connect with them and build trusting relationships. The workplace culture we create, along with our leadership styles, plays an essential role in supporting the positive psychological health of individuals and teams. A workplace that is healthy and safe just makes good business sense. I would like to walk you through an exercise to help you understand how we unknowingly speak about mental illness in a stigma-filled way. This may seem uncomfortable at first, but this exercise just may open your mind to new realizations. The first step is for you to come up with as many negative, judgmental, and stigma-filled words as you can about an individual with mental illness. Simply write down all the words you can think of that you may have used or that others may have used, and include things you've heard in movies, television, music, as well as among friends, family, and colleagues. And since I have just asked you to do something fairly unusual, let me lead by example. Crazy. Nuts. Attention-seeking. Now pause the video and make your own list. Keep going until you can't think of any more. Okay, have you completed your list? I thought you might like to see this compilation of the words that others have come up with over the years when completing this exercise. You are not alone if you know a surprisingly large number of stigma-filled words. Now, for step 2, I will ask that you do the same thing, but this time with a twist. I would like you to try to come up with negative, stigma-filled, judgmental words, but this time describing someone with cancer. Pause the video now to make your list. Done? How did it go? Is your list the same length as the first one? My guess is you may have had some difficulty with the second part. Because the truth is, in today's society, we simply don't see, hear, or use stigma-filled words regarding someone with cancer or any illness understood to be something that happens to a person. We feel empathy for individuals who have had the misfortune to be diagnosed with any illness deemed not their fault. And when we feel empathy, stigma loses its power. The purpose of this exercise is to help you realize the different ways we see physical and mental illness. And I hope this new understanding will help you to stop stigma in its tracks. There are 3 common misconceptions about mental illness to come from movies and TV that I'd like to share with you. The first is that people with mental illness are prone to unprovoked, erratic acts of violence. This can be seen in the famous shower sequence in Psycho, when Norman Bates attacks Marion Crane. Another more recent example can be found in The Visit, when the characters Nana and Pop Pop torment their grandchildren in progressively violent ways. These are only 2 of many examples of individuals with a mental illness being portrayed in movies, television, and news media as violent. The truth, however, is the exact opposite. People with serious mental illnesses are, in fact, more likely to be victims of violence themselves than the general population. This is true in many parts of the world. For example, in the UK, the majority of crimes are committed by people who do not have a mental illness. Moreover, people with mental illnesses are more likely to be a danger to themselves than they are to others. 90% of people who died by suicide in the UK had a mental illness. And according to the British Crime Survey, only 1% of victims believed the violent incident happened because the offender had a mental illness. The second common misconception is that people with mental illness won't or don't want to seek help because they don't trust medical professionals. A prime example is One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, where mental health professionals such as psychiatrists and therapists are depicted as cold, ineffective, or even cruel. This furthers the myth that those with mental illness have nowhere to turn. The truth is, with dedicated time and support from a trusted professional, individuals can find the care they need to better manage their mental health. By not showing characters who successfully manage symptoms of mental illness, we further perpetuate this image of victimhood, of giving up, and of fatalistic thinking. The third common misconception is that people with mental illness are overly dramatic or extreme in their daily lives. In order to create compelling narratives, too often film and television will focus on the more extreme aspects of a particular illness, but not offer the context of their overall lives. This is similar to what we see on social media, where we tend to highlight our good moments rather than our sad or boring ones, creating the impression that we are all happy all the time. Just as this is not realistic, life is of course a series of ups and downs, the same goes with people with mental illness. It may not be as gut-wrenching or dramatic to watch, but many real people can manage their mental illness and live relatively drama-free lives.